Yes, yes, a lot.
The first, I didn't know you were all hard people. The first lady is my favorite teacher of all time, Miss Alma Spikes. Miss Alma, I remember mainly because I remember my husband once, after we'd been out of school for years and years and years, told me one day, said, "Why don't you call Miss Alma someday and ask her if she would chaperone us to walk up to the beach?" And she would have said, "Yes, I'll go." She would have been about 80 at that time. Yes. She never turned anybody down from school that she'd ever had in school when they called and asked if she would take about a dozen kids and walk to the beach. About 8 or 9 hour trip, or 8 or 9 miles, and she always was ready to go. And if we wanted someone to chaperone us for 2 weeks at the beach and all the mosquitoes, to spend time up there camping in a tent, she was ready to go. And before that, it was out to Burrow in a tent, and she was ready to go for that. She was just that kind of person, and everything was all right. And she was just the best, and she lived long and was always able to go. And her hikes, she was a heavy woman, but she wore these little pumps about that high, and how on earth she walked in those I never could understand, because I always had to have loafers, and but she made it, and she'd walk to the beach every step of the way with us high school kids and think nothing of it. The second person on my list, the Eddie Mae Herron Center was named after her. Miss Eddie Mae began her teaching career in what was known as the Biggers Colored School in 1940. But she moved with the children to Pocahontas with the closure of the Bigger School. In this one-room school here, Miss Eddie Mae taught everything with heavy emphasis on the basics, including reading, of course. Court records reveal that Miss Eddie Mae Hill, which was her original name, married E.W. Herron in 1936, and they list her as age 26 at that time of marriage. And now that was in 36 that she married the first time. In 1959, Miss Eddie Mae married Ollie McDaniel. After his death, she would marry one final time to Elbert Henry Jones in 1965. Based on the ages listed for Eddie Mae on marriage records, she was born around 1908 or 1910. When the one-room school on Archer Street here in Pocahontas, which is now the Eddie Mae Center, closed due to consolidation, Miss Eddie Mae was hired by the Pocahontas Public School to teach reading, but moved to Blytheville after the first year of teaching here. She held an A.B. degree from Philander Smith College in Little Rock and had done graduate study in reading, science, and health at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. Those who remember her point also to many other things. Miss Eddie Mae taught to the children in grades 1 through 8. She taught health, home economics, civics, penmanship, music, and even drama, with plays produced on homemade television screens and annual Christmas programs. Hers was a classroom always open to parents, and hers was a classroom which is today remembered by former students as a place where we had everything we needed for learning. It was one former, as one former student said, it was a place where I've learned pretty much everything I know. You can see why the Eddie Mae Herron Center was named for her. The next lady of distinction on my list, I remember very well, Mary Bates Sallee. I know Mary like she was one of my relatives because not long after she and Dean married, they moved into my grandmother Martin's upstairs. Grandmother had an apartment up there. For the year that it was built, it was very nice. And they lived up there for many years until they built their first home. Mary was a lot of fun, and I also knew them very well because I was in their Sunday school class as a teenager. Mary taught the girls of the class while Dean taught the boys. My cousin Jean Alvey played the piano for us when we sang hymns. And Mary went to a lot of trouble to make all of her lessons interesting. And that's why I believe that she was so interesting as a teacher, because she went to a lot of trouble for to make her students interested in what she was teaching them. She started out as a third grade teacher, and I thought that's where she would remain. She liked it so, and the teachers liked her so. When I left here to go to the U of A for my first year of college, I had not had home ec at all. It was not taught here. We had nobody to teach home ec. So Barbara Sallee, my cousin, who lived with me at the university, and I were the only two girls in our class at the university who had never had home ec in school. And it was difficult to sew and make clothing when you didn't know how. Anyway, we managed to get through it. Anyway, after we left here with Mary teaching third grade, she went on to the U of A and got enough hours to teach home ec here forever, you might say. She was the first home ec teacher, and she taught many, many years. And her students just loved her. And it was very unusual for a student to go through school here and not take home ec from Mary. Let's see, the next person on my list is my aunt, Eunice Blankenship Oball. My grandparents, Frank and Elizabeth Blankenship, had 7 children, and all of them had to work at the Star Herald. After all, Grandpa was not able to buy a linotype. They cost $25,000. Back in, Grandma and Grandpa had moved here in 1902 from Middlebrook up above Maynard. And they wanted to be sure and teach their children how to handset type. And every one of the children helped every week in setting every word that went into the Star Herald. My Aunt Ouida was the fastest handsetter. She told me years later how many words she could set per minute. I don't remember what it was because we never used that kind of handset type. We had 2 linotypes when I went to the office as editor many years later. My grandfather bought 2 newspapers here. There were 2 newspapers when he came to Pocahontas, and he bought both of them and merged them. One of them was the Pocahontas Star, the other one was the Randolph Herald, and he named them the Pocahontas Star Herald. And he went on and edited and published them until he died in 1930, at which time my father, the oldest son, became editor. He sure didn't last long. He didn't like that much work that much. So in 1935, that was 1930, he took over. 1935, he sent for his oldest sister, Eunice Oball, who lived in Beaumont, Texas. Her husband had been the Missouri Pacific Railroad head of it there. And they had lived there their entire married life, raised 2 children, a son and daughter, and she had just lost her husband in his late 40s. So Daddy sent word to her that she needed to come and take over as editor. He would sell her half of his, or a fourth of the paper, which was a half of, he owned a half, Grandma owned a half, and he offered Aunt Eunice a half of his half. So they would all own a portion. Daddy became advertising manager, and he wouldn't work as hard anymore. He wasn't working hard to begin with. He thought he was. Anyway, Aunt Eunice was glad to come on back home after all those years. She was in her early 40s at that time. right over and did very well. And for years and years, she won many medals and this, that, and the other for her writings. And she was once head of the Arkansas Women's Writers of Arkansas. And when she was 69, I believe it was, she died, and I took over at that time. That was in '63 that I took over. The next woman on here is also one of my aunts, Pauline, Mae's Blankenship, the wife of my uncle, Joe Blankenship. Of course, Aunt Pauline came on because through kinship. Aunt Eunice needed someone as a social editor, and Aunt Pauline was very good at that. She liked social things, and the first thing she did was start a column. She called every woman in this county, probably, and got their recipes. And it wasn't long until everybody here had everybody else's recipes, and they were very good recipes from big families, and they were glad to get them. And they were some of the best recipes I have a lot of them stashed away. And then she was very good at calling people for who visited who, what'd you do last week, what'd you do yesterday, and things that you don't like to tell, but people like to read. And she got them. She didn't mind asking anything. So that was what Polly managed to do. The next distinguished lady on here is another one of mine.
Was it you that made the list?
I made the list, but I didn't put me on it. You all have probably never heard of this aunt. She left here in 1925. My Aunt Ouida, Blankenship Thompson. When I was 2, she started teaching me at school music and expression. If you don't know what expression is, it's, she taught me all kinds of cute little poems to stand up and say up on the stage, and I was scared to death, of course, every time. And if I forgot what I was supposed to say, well, I had a prompter behind the curtain to help me along. And I started when I was 2, and it went on until I was about 5 or 6, somewhere along there. And at which time they moved to Nashville, Tennessee, to a suburb, Franklin, Tennessee. And she taught until she was 93. One of her sisters, my father's sister, one of the older sisters, lived to be 103. So I'm aiming for that. I have another cousin on here. Dorothy Lee Keith Bates. Dorothy was a writer, but Dorothy enjoyed entering contests, and it was surprising how many she won. I remember one time I was very proud of her. The Arkansas Gazette started a contest in which, I don't know, it had something to do with maps. And I tried it for several weeks. Decided, well, heck, this is just too much work to this. And I found out that Dorothy was working on it, and I said, what are you doing? Well, I use this so-and-so, and I measure all the maps that they put in and everything. Then about several months later, after she had worked on this thing for several months, she beat every person in the state and won quite a nice prize for it. She also won a loving cup. You see, back in the 20s when she was in school, all of the very best in every room, every grade in high school still went to Little Rock to compete in all subjects. I'm talking about 10th graders, 11th, 12th. And if you were outstanding in certain subjects, you went to Little Rock every year to the contests. And Dorothy usually went. My uncle, Joe Blankenship, won the state voice contest more than once. And it wasn't just for up here, it was also for a musical talent and different things like that. Dorothy won. She beat everyone in the state in geometry, of all things. Then, later, she became a multi-millionaire after she wrote about, I don't know how many dozen books. She found out that there were no books for people that liked to figure out
crossword puzzles.
Crossword puzzles. And she wrote one book with nothing in it but one letter words. Another book with 2-letter words. Another book with 3-letter
What happened to the microphone?
and she became a multi-millionaire. So help me. I thought, my lands, why didn't I think of that? Maude Keith Cadwallader, I know you haven't heard of her, most of you haven't. She was Dorothy's father's sister. And she never lived here after she got through teenage. She moved away to Missouri. And she came back here once because the Baptist Church had just built its new building on Thomasville there across from the Methodist. And they needed someone to paint their baptistry. So they heard about what an artist she was. So she came down here and painted their baptistry. And then she moved down here and stayed for a while. And she had quite a name as an artist.
It's still the painting that's at the baptistry. It is, yeah, it is.
Yes. Jessie Long Davis, you might have known her as Ann Davis. I knew her, I always called her Ann Davis. In more modern times, she was our only artist, and she was a good one. She and her father ran a very popular grocery here at one time. Later, she just made her living for her husband also had a position, but she made her part of the living just with her ability as an artist. Vida Throgmorton taught music all through the time I was in school. She was married to one of the most well-known doctors here. One reason he was so well-known, he delivered me when I was born. She was Dr. Throgmorton's second wife. She was very unusual. I don't know that Miss Throgmorton was all that talented, really. When I think about what she played, she always played for us to enter the assembly and get up and go out of the assembly. We tried to march by what she played. She played the same one every time. And we all ask ourselves, is that all she knows? Always couldn't keep from asking. But anyway, we always tried to keep time. She taught a few children violin, and we got to listen to them in assembly, and she taught a few piano. We who were not talented, the school bought forks and spoons and wooden blocks, and we kept time. And it helped because they painted them bright colors. And that's how we who were not talented learned music. Next is a woman I remember quite well, Nancy James Jones. And I'm sure you all are wondering who that is. She owned Pat's building down here, the St. Charles Hotel, where the Star Herald was when I was born. It's right down here.
Next to Mary Rayford.
Next to Mary Rayford's building on the east side of the square. And the St. Charles was built in 1850, I believe it was. It burned in, Pat, when did it burn? 1920. It covered all the area from Everett Street, East Everett there, where the Llewellyn building started, all the way down to where Child's Jewelry went, almost to Mary Draper's. It was a large building, and its principal use was during the Civil War, when different groups would come in. They'd either be north or south, and they'd take it over and use it while they were in the city. And other than that, Aunt Nancy would rent it out, of course. It was a very large building for a town this size. Her claim to fame also was the fact that she had a daughter who married the richest Jew we ever had, Abe Schneebaum. You might never have heard of Abe Schneebaum, but he came to Pocahontas and got rich from Greece. And I knew her very well and knew him very well. My grandmother told me that before Miss Nancy Jones' daughter, when she started dating Abe, he finally proposed. She was the daughter of one of Aunt Nancy's daughters who had not been married when Lila was born. She was born out of wedlock, and Aunt Nancy had raised her, and Abe Schneebaum fell in love with her. And when he proposed to her, she told him, "I will marry you, but if you ever mention the circumstances of my birth, I will leave you." And he never did mention it. Aunt Nancy lived to be 98. And I used to go to my grandmother's house on Thomasville, and I'd see Aunt Nancy come out to the end of her daughters. She was living with another daughter, a Mrs. Dunklin, Flora Dunklin. She would come out to the end of the sidewalk and stand there wanting to get across Thomasville. But there were so many teams and wagons going by, and that was an old dirt road that Grandmother would say, "Ann, go walk Aunt Nancy across the street." And I'd have to go and let that little old woman, she was up in her 90s, she'd catch on to my elbow and I'd walk her across the street. And her family bought a window in the Methodist church to her, and they put her name on it in honor of Nancy Jones, age 98, and she died that year. I sit by that window every week in the Methodist church.
And just to be clear, Aunt Nancy was not your aunt, right?
No, but if you were 98, people will soon call me Aunt Ann. 93. Yeah. The next one on my list is Mary S. Wiley Brown. Now, she was a smart old lady. I don't know, I wish all of you had known Mary Brown. She owned Mary Brown's Cafe, the Arcoma Dining Room. It was where, what's her name, has that?
Mary Raper.
Mae Herron has that establishment on the corner there. She knew more about John Kaiser than anybody. She was the first one that suspected John Kaiser in this town. He was a supposed very distinguished man who was poisoning members of his family. Before it was over, I think it was 13 people that they proved that he might have poisoned. And a lot of them, several of them, he was married to or married their daughters or something like that, and he had insured each of them and such. And Miss Brown had gotten very, well, she knew quite a lot about him. Miss Brown had lost her husband. She lived, before she opened her Arcoma Dining Room, she also ran the a bus station there, so it was a very busy corner, don't think it wasn't. And it was the busiest cafe in town. She had a huge family. She had, I don't know how many brothers and more sisters, and each of them had many children. So her cafe was run by her nieces and nephews as waiters and waitresses. And the oldest of the entire bunch was Alma Spikes, the cook. And she was an excellent cook. And those were the only people that worked for Mary Brown. And the oldest of the waitresses, Hazel Jones, who was Casey Jones' daughter, told me what I know about what Mary Brown told her that she knew about John Kaiser. She said that her Aunt Mame, they didn't call her Aunt Mary, they called her Aunt Mame. Aunt Mame sat in the chair up in the front window where she could see out and see the courthouse, the old courthouse on the west side there. But she didn't look at the courthouse. She turned around and looked at all her tables and who was sitting at them and listened all the time to what people were saying. And one day, John Kaiser, first I need to tell you that she had a farm out on Holster Lane. Then, that wasn't even called Holster Lane. It was out in the country. Today, you can get out there in just a few minutes. But then, there wasn't a paved road in the county. It was just a lane then. And after her husband died, rather young, and she was rather young, John Kaiser started courting her, but she was rather suspicious of him. And especially after he came out to see her one day, and she had heard that he hated dogs terribly. Many of his neighbors had said that he killed dogs, that he just hated dogs. Didn't know why, but he hated dogs. She said as he left her house that day, her dog followed him out to the car, and she saw him give her dog something to eat. And as soon as he left, her dog died. So she was already suspicious, so that made her more so. And it wasn't long after that till one day he came into her restaurant. This wasn't the first time that he had done this. After a insurance man had come in and sat down at the table, and John came in and sat down at the table. Well, of course, Mae Brown became intensely interested, and her ears perked up, and she had to listen to everything that they were saying. He had just lost his wife. Everybody that died at his house died of malaria. Malaria was something that if you had it, you had the same symptoms that you had if you were poisoned. And most of these people that got sick at his house, who were related to him, had the symptoms of malaria. So they all had died of malaria. He had just lost his second or third wife, and he had adopted the woman's son, who was ready to graduate that year from BHS. And when Miss Brown was listening to what was going on, she knew that Kaiser was taking out a $500 policy on this boy. And after he took out the policy and he got up and left, she went over. Her niece told me, said she went over and begged him, please do not insure Bonner Kaiser. Said you're signing that boy's death warrant. She said, I never heard whether or not he went ahead and did it, but I think he did. It doesn't make any difference whether he did or not. Bonner Kaiser was dead before he graduated.
Oh.
But that was another case that Miss Brown knew about, and other people didn't.
Mary Frances knew him too.
I know everybody older than you are. I was there for all these occasions.
Yes, yes. The next lady is a very distinguished lady here. It's Mary Frances's mother, Mary Martha Peters Burke. the Peters family that Miss Burke came from was a very distinguished family here. We had, I can't talk about the Peters family though without mentioning Joe Pete. I would have to mention that part of the Peters family also, but there were many, many other members of the family. Robert Jones, a fella here that joined the Army when he got out of high school and World War II started, he became a lifetime Army man. And he went all over the world. And after the war was over and he was tired of being away from home, and his wife had followed him to all these other countries and everything, his last hitch in the Army was at Guam. They both were over there. And he said, I was so homesick, said I finally decided I'm going to get out of the Army. I don't care if I haven't been in a long time. I'm going home. He said as soon, I don't know whether you all have seen all these exhibits that the museum has out, but one of the exhibits is of Joe Pete's family. It's the first one to the right of the door as you come in here. And one of the pictures is of little Annie Peters, Joe Peters' little tiny sister. She was the tiniest little thing I ever saw in my life. And she came to work every day. She lived by herself in her little house. She never married. Lived by herself up there across from the swimming pool. Had a nice little house. It was a duplex. I think she lived in one of the two apartments. Rented the other one out, and she walked all that way every day. And Robert said he was so glad to be home, and he walked all the way up to Joe Pete's and started to cross the street, and he looked up the street and he saw little Annie Peters walking down the street with her little basket full of her lunch for the day, and he knew he was home. He said that was a picture that he could never have thought of anywhere, but that made him know he was home when he saw little Annie Peters. Anyway, that was a family that we all knew, and people still talk about Joe Pete's. You people that weren't here to know Joe Pete's variety store, I'm sorry you didn't. Now, Miss Burke, after she lost her husband rather young in life, she and Miss Minnie Mays got together and opened a ladies' shop, ladies' dress shop on the west side of the square there in what was later the Poe's building. And I remember when they opened it, it was in the 30s, wasn't it, Mary Frances? And they did very well there for a while. But Miss Burke had property on this street, Everett Street here, and Miss Mays didn't especially care about being in business of that type, So Miss Burke bought Mrs. Mace out and opened Burke's shop and moved to her store on this street. And it wasn't long until the war came and her daughter, Mary Frances here, married Jim Brackett, who was an officer over at the air base. He trained airmen, didn't he? And he and Mary Frances both joined her mother, and they kept growing, and Jim opened a men's store in with the ladies department. Then they opened also a beauty shop in the back of the store, and it became one of the most popular shops that we've ever had here. Miss Burke, of course, was very active in the St. Paul's Church also, all her life. The next one, since I just mentioned Miss Burke, I've got to mention Hattie King. Hattie Burrow King. I said when I was writing Mrs. King's obituary that I doubted if in my lifetime there was ever another woman that ever lived in my lifetime with the amount of business acumen of Hattie King that ever lived in this little town again. I thought that Hattie did have a lot of business sense. Anybody that can be raised at Warm Springs and in her daddy's little bitty store out there, and not have any formal training other than Maude's first store, come to Pocahontas and do what she did. Now, she did go bankrupt 2 or 3 times. That helps. Back in those days, if you went bankrupt and were smart enough, you came out ahead. And I'm sure she did. Anyway, she's the only person that ever built a department store in Pocahontas. We're very small here. She and her husband, as long as Jim lived, he did his part. And it's like she said, we're very safe, and when Jim gets out of the tub, I get in the same water. People here laugh about that forever. But they had 2 dime stores, not both at once, but 2 different. One was a Ben Franklin, and one was just a dime store, 5 and dime. And they had a beauty shop, of course. That was how Virginia Burrow came here and married Hattie's brother.
These genuine lizard high-heel shoes and bag were purchased by Ann Carroll at Hattie King's department store.
I never paid that much for anything before.
She actually wore these.
Until my feet hurt so bad I couldn't.
They were made by Life Stride. You all remember Life Stride. But genuine lizard.
Yeah.
from Hattie King.
I was very proud of them.
Right in style today. Right in style.
Carol's had them for sale ever since she opened. 3 stores ago. And she can't sell them because she's trying to get $75 out of them. I'd rather she'd sell them for 10. I'm nearly done. I'm down to Helen Dixon Bly. Helen was one of the 3 very intelligent Dixon girls. She and her 2 sisters were some of the smartest girls we've ever had here. The Dixons owned a grocery store here. They moved here from Redland Springs, where they lived all their lives, and I don't know just what age the girls were when they moved here, but they, the thing that about Helen was that she loved what she had, and she would fight for anything. The first thing that she came out big for here was the old courthouse. We had a mayor that was serving back in, I think it was the 30s, might have been the 40s by then, who wanted to tear the old courthouse down, or why not sell it and to the Standard Oil Company for a service station right out in the middle of town.
Location, location, location.
And if we don't do that with it, why don't we make a fire station out of it? Have a fire station right out in the middle of the city. And then he decided, let's just tear it down. Well, Helen just got busy and looked and scraped and looked and found out that when the city had gotten the right from the county to use the building, the city had taken the building over from the county because the county it was the county's building, but the county had given the city the right to use it. But Helen found out that if the city ever quit using it as a city entity, it reverted to the county. And nobody knew that until Helen looked it up on the books there in the old courthouse. So that saved the old courthouse. It went back to the county, and the county took it over for a library. And her husband, Harold Bly, helped her in every bit of it. And it wasn't long until here the fight came up between half the people here that were for the Water Valley Dam and Helen and her bunch that were against it, and Helen won. She owned a lot of land out there, and many people owned land, owned their homes and their farms and everything. And there was quite a fight here at that time, and there are still a lot of hard feelings that occurred at that time. As far as I'm concerned, since I own the newspaper, I was threatened by people who own businesses. You better be on our side and try to get that dam, or you're not going to get any advertising at all. Now, that's the kind of talk I got. So you had to act like you were on both sides. I mean, it was rough here. Don't think it wasn't. Next, I have Lucille Smith Stolt, our first elected woman.
Yay.
Yeah, I hear a few yays. I don't know how many women who were really, Miss Alma Spikes, the first one I mentioned up here. She was a very capable teacher all her life, principal of the school and everything else, and they wouldn't elect her, and she was the breadwinner of her family. Ouida. No, she's a woman. They wouldn't elect her to anything down at the courthouse. No. We had another woman who was very popular here, who has passed away this week at the age of 108, Marie Davis. She worked for every man that ever had office down at the courthouse, from 1920 until I don't know when. She ran for office once and didn't get anywhere. She ran a good race for a woman, but, and there were other women that were well capable. For instance, I told you that Helen Dixon Bly was very intelligent. She had one sister at the university when I was up there who was genius rated. Another sister had worked for everybody at the courthouse. She ran and didn't do well. So that for Lucille Stolt to finally run and win, that is quite an honor for her. That is what distinguishes her for being a woman of distinction in Pocahontas. And the last one is my aunt, Lila Martin Sallee.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Aunt Lila, she was really something. She was the first public health nurse. And she was appointed to this distinguished office in 1930 when I was 8 years old. And we didn't know what it was all about. Her two little tiny daughters and my twin sisters, they were twins. Her oldest daughter was 6 months older than I. Her youngest daughter was a little younger than my twin sisters. And the five of us were at grandmother's house daily. Aunt Lila had lost her husband, Sallee, while he was in his early 30s. She needed work. She was an RN, and she was very glad to get this first public health nurse job, and she had to drive over these hills. There wasn't a paved road in the county. Every hill was 6 times as high as it is now. It came down. Take my word for it.
Road.
She needed a car, and Uncle Landy, her brother, Landy Martin, bought her a model Ford and taught her to drive. He would take her out every evening when he got off work and teach her to drive. Now, I was a little woman. She never drove that she didn't look between.
Oh, I got some.
Yeah. That was how she could barely see over the. And it was just amazing. She went over every bumpy road. I just can't tell you what the great big rocks looked like. It was terrible because we went with her. Us kids had to go with her and boil the water for she would boil 12 needles at a time. And here would be 100 people standing here to be shot. Single-handedly, she wiped out typhoid and diphtheria, and I don't know what else, but she did. Now, it was everywhere. I lost a sister-in-law before I even knew her in Indiana. It was everywhere. And she died of typhoid. It was everywhere then. And my mother-in-law told me of how many of her children had diphtheria and different, these dread diseases. But there was a vaccine for it. But could you get in your horse and wagon and go all these miles from the country into town to a doctor and take your hard-earned money and pay him to shoot everybody in the, we called it shooting them, shoot everybody in the family?
Tell them about how some of the fathers would hold a gun on her.
Oh, yes. Aunt Lila had a gun held on her many times when she getting ready to vaccinate.
They thought the kid would die.
And Dr. Robert used to come and get her and come go with me, and I gotta catch a baby. And she'd go and catch a baby with him. And one night, I remember she came home and told us about, she said, I had to turn the lights of my car through the window of a home so we could see for the woman to have the baby. It was, we heard a lot of stories back then because she started in 1930 and she worked until the 40s. Then they appointed 4 of those nurses from all of the state, 1 for each district. and Aunt Lila was appointed as the one for Northeast Arkansas. And they each were appointed to the headquarters in Little Rock. And they were, Aunt Lila, after she was no longer in Pocahontas, she went to Little Rock. And would go each week to a different county in Northeast Arkansas. Somebody else would go to Northwest, then to the Southern.
Didn't she do something with syphilis?
Huh?
Syphilis?
What about it? I didn't catch it.
Talk of her working with syphilis treatment.
Well, I'm sure she worked with everything there was to work with, and she ran into some terrible things.
Ann, would you be interested in having some questions?
Yeah, if you want to
If
ask
anybody
me
has any
some
questions.
questions, I don't know whether I can answer them.
Well, you mentioned the lady was elected, but you haven't mentioned to what?
And what year?
Lucille County
Oh,
Clerk.
Lucille County Clerk.
Oh, okay.
And what year was that?
Oh, I just don't remember what year Lucille got in. It must have been up in the 50s or 60s.
I wanna say 50s.
Yeah.
I think 50s.
Uh-huh.
Did she quit running or did she get defeated?
No, he wasn't sheriff, he was city, marshal.
City marshal.
Mhm.
This gentleman over here had a question.
You mentioned beach earlier, walking to the beach.
Kurt. Oh, yeah, Kurt River Beach.
That was Current River Beach then?
Yeah, Current River
Okay.
Beach. My lands,
Hey,
Current River Beach was something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I think we'll hear a lot more about Kurt River Beach when we have the growing up in Pocahontas story. I
Yeah.
think everybody's gonna talk about Kurt River Beach.
Uh-huh. Now listen, Current River Beach was a place, I mean,
Where did
especially
you walk from? Where did she walk from?
here.
In Pocahontas?
Well, we usually would start at the school or at the Methodist church because Miss Alma also was the head of the Girl Scouts. And a lot of times they'd want to go.
And you walked all the way to Kurt? Did you get
Why
rides?
not?
Did you get back?
No, we didn't hitchhike. We walked every step. Yes, sir.
It's about 9 miles.
Yeah.
The road's gravel.
No, the road to the beach was paved in 1930, and we never asked Miss Alva to go before then. Yeah, we were nice.
Anybody else?
You see, and I have a question. I was looking at one of the documents on Mary Francis's mother, and it states that she was a charter member of the Pocahontas Business and Women's.
Uh-huh.
BNPW.
How long was that active here?
Well, I think that, Mary Frances, when do you think it started? About the 30s or 40s?
It could have been
Uh-huh.
a long time.
Now, were you two members of that also?
No, I was wrong.
Were you Miss Ann?
What did she say?
Were you a member of the Business and Professional Women's?
No, I never did join.
Okay, because I know Walnut Ridge right now has an active group, and I didn't know if you girls had been a part of that when it was.
Well, it was very active, but at that time, I was not down at the Star Herald.
Okay, thank you.
Ann, we'd like to present you with this lovely bouquet. We want you to take it home and put it in your living room and enjoy it.
Well, I'll sure take it.
All right. Women of Distinction of Randolph County exhibit will be open for another month or two, and we're open to suggestions if any of you want to suggest somebody that we include in the exhibit. I will say there's one thing in common with all the women. They're all deceased, because we didn't want to get into any fights about who's distinguished in town and who's not. So if you know anybody, please nominate. We'll gather material and put them in the exhibit also. So we'd like to invite you to enjoy the punch and the cake and the cookies over here, and take a look around the museum if you'd like, if you hadn't been here in a while. But for sure, look at the Women of Distinction exhibit. There's a lot more information about the women in it.